Okay, so you want to own Airbnb. Don't buy a single building, don't manage a single property, don't even keep a maintenance crew on payroll. Just sit in the middle of millions of spare rooms and apartments scattered across almost every country on earth and take a cut every time a stranger hands another stranger the keys to their home. Here's the problem. Airbnb is not really in the business of renting out spare bedrooms. It is in the business of selling trust between two people who will likely never meet in person before one of them lets the other one inside. And the fee you collect is really the price of convincing both sides that trust is safe to extend. Let's start with the fact that there isn't just one kind of host on this platform. There's the original idea from 2008. Someone renting out an air mattress in their own living room for a weekend, the exact situation the company was built around. There's the individual owner renting out a single second property, treating it like a part-time investment. There's the small-scale operator running 5 or 10 units across the city as an actual job. And then there's the professional property management company running hundreds of listings under one account, using the platform less like a spare room marketplace and more like a hotel chain that happens to own none of its own buildings. 4 completely different businesses sitting inside the same app, and it's that smallest group, the professional multi-listing operators, that quietly accounts for a disproportionate share of the total nights booked and the total money moving through the platform every year. It didn't start anywhere close to that scale. In 2007, 2 roommates in San Francisco, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia, couldn't make rent, so they blew up 3 air mattresses on their apartment floor and rented them out to strangers attending a design conference, calling it Air Bed and Breakfast. For the next 2 years, almost nobody wanted to fund it. Investors passed on the idea of strangers sleeping in strangers' homes so many times that the founders financed the company for a while by selling limited edition breakfast cereal, Obama O's, and Captain McCain's. Time to the 2008 election, making around $30,000 just to keep the lights on. What actually turned the business around wasn't a new feature. It was noticing that the listing photos on the site were terrible, so the founders flew to New York themselves with a rented camera and photographed hosts' apartments for free. Bookings in that market roughly doubled within weeks. The lesson that carried the company from an idea investors kept rejecting to eventually joining the startup accelerator Y Combinator in 2009 wasn't about technology at all. It was that trust sells better with a good photograph. Here's where the naive mental model starts to break down. You think the expensive part is building the booking app, the calendar, the payment processing, the search algorithm that ranks listings. That part, relatively speaking, is the cheap part, something a competent engineering team can ship in a year. The expensive part is everything built to make 2 strangers feel safe enough to go through with the transaction at all. Government ID verification, selfie matching, background checks in markets where that's legally possible, host guarantee insurance, and a support team available around the clock for the moment something goes wrong at 2 a.m. on the other side of the planet. None of that shows up in a product demo. All of it shows up the day a guest trashes a 5-bedroom house or a stranger falls off a balcony. And the company that promised 2 strangers they could trust each other is the one holding the bill. Here's the part almost nobody prices in correctly. Not fraud, not property damage. Regulation, city by city. Airbnb doesn't operate under one national law. It operates under tens of thousands of separate local rules, and plenty of major markets have already narrowed what's allowed. Barcelona has moved to phase out short-term rental licenses across the entire city by 2028. Berlin caps how many days a year a whole home can be rented out. San Francisco requires hosts to register and actually live in the unit they list. Each of those rules can change entirely with a single vote from a city council that owes the company nothing. Building a global booking platform is a software problem. Staying legal in every jurisdiction that platform touches is a permanent, expanding legal and lobbying operation that never actually finishes, because the moment one city's rules are settled, another city is drafting new ones. So how does Airbnb actually make its money once it's running? It charges the host a service fee of a few percent per booking, and it charges the guest a separate service fee on top, typically somewhere in the mid-teens as a percentage of the total reservation. On top of that sits the cleaning fee, set by the host, not the platform, which drew enough guest backlash over hidden costs appearing only at checkout that Airbnb rolled out a total price display by default in December of 2022, showing the full cost upfront instead of a smaller number that grew as you clicked through. Neither the host's home nor the guest's money ever really needs Airbnb to exist physically. The company is purely the layer that connects the two and takes its cut for making the match feel safe. In 2023, hosts and guests moved more than $73 billion in total bookings through the platform, and Airbnb kept roughly $9.9 billion of that as revenue, a take rate of around 13.5%. Close to $4.8 billion of that revenue fell straight to the bottom line as profit, the most profitable year in the company's history. 4 years after going public in December of 2020, at a valuation north of $100 billion. Here's the part of this business that flips the naive assumption on its head. Airbnb never actually owns the asset generating the revenue. If a neighborhood goes quiet, if a host's apartment sits empty for a month, if the local real estate market crashes, none of that shows up as a loss on Airbnb's books because Airbnb never bought the apartment in the first place. That risk sits entirely with the host. Compare that to a company like WeWork, which took on decades of lease obligations on buildings it didn't own and nearly collapsed under the weight of that debt the moment demand dipped. Airbnb built the opposite structure on purpose, all of the upside of real estate exposure, almost none of the downside, because the properties were never its properties to begin with. That same disconnect between risk and ownership shows up at a smaller scale too, in something called rental arbitrage. Someone signs a normal 12-month lease on an apartment, sometimes with the landlord's knowledge and sometimes without it, then turns around and relists that same unit nightly on Airbnb, pocketing the difference between what they pay in rent and what dozens of short stays bring in over a month. It's become common enough that entire online communities exist just to teach people how to find landlords willing to allow it. And companies have built businesses managing dozens of arbitraged units at once, controlling none of the underlying real estate and still running what functions as a full hotel operation. Airbnb collects its fee on every one of those bookings the same way it would from an owner-occupied spare room. It has no reason to care whether the person listing a property actually owns it, leases it, or is quietly violating their own lease to be there at all. That's not a loophole the company built by accident. It's the direct consequence of a platform that was never designed to verify ownership in the first place, only to verify that a booking happened. Airbnb also likes to advertise the idea of a host earning meaningful side income from a spare room. And for plenty of hosts, that's genuinely true. But the actual distribution of that income is lopsided. The company's own Superhost program, reserved for hosts who maintain high ratings, low cancellation rates, and fast response times, gets better placement in search results and access to bonuses. The average listing never sees. Which means the algorithm itself is quietly nudging bookings toward hosts who already treat the platform like a business rather than the person renting a room twice a year. Multiply that advantage across millions of listings, and you get a market where relatively small numbers of professionalized hosts and management companies capture a large share of total earnings, while the casual host who inspired the whole idea in 2008 earns a smaller slice of a much bigger pie than the marketing suggests. That resilience wasn't guaranteed, and it was tested almost immediately. In March of 2020, bookings collapsed nearly overnight as the pandemic shut down travel worldwide, and Airbnb lost roughly 80% of its business in the span of about 8 weeks. The company cut about a quarter of its entire workforce that May and quietly shelved the public offering it had already been preparing for. What actually pulled it back from the edge wasn't a return to business travel or vacations. It was people working remotely for the first time, discovering they could book a place in the mountains for a month instead of a weekend, a category the company hadn't really planned for and could barely have predicted. By the time Airbnb finally went public that December, 9 months after nearly running out of runway, it did so during the exact pandemic that had almost killed it, on the strength of a use case nobody at the company had designed the platform around in the first place. Now let's talk about what happens when the one risk Airbnb can't design around actually hits hardest. In September of 2023, New York City enforced a law known as Local Law 18, requiring any short-term rental host to register with the city and be physically present in the home for the entire stay. Effectively banning the whole apartment rental, Airbnb had been built on for 15 years in one of its largest markets. The company sued to block it and lost. Active short-term listings in New York City collapsed almost overnight, dropping from more than 20,000 to a small fraction of that number within weeks. Not because of a recession, not because guests stopped wanting to visit New York, but because a single city council vote made the core product illegal to sell there. Airbnb had spent years engineering its business to carry none of the real estate risk. Nobody had priced in how much risk a single piece of local legislation could still carry. So if you do decide to build or buy something like Airbnb, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how many listings you could add to the map. The app was never the product. It was whether cities kept allowing strangers to rent out their homes in the first place, and when that permission disappears, no amount of trust and safety infrastructure can book its way out of the math.